Yes, good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to talk here. I'm one of the lead authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'm a professor for physics of the climate system, and I'm going to talk about climate change and tell you why there's a business case for climate change abatement. Because climate change is going to come to us. Some things just wait until we discover and understand them. Climate change won't. It won't wait for us to understand it. It won't wait for us to adapt to it. So we better adapt to what we can change and avoid what we can't adapt to. Let me tell you the basics first of climate change. If I master the technique first. Here we go. CO2, carbon dioxide, is increasing in the atmosphere dramatically since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, along with other greenhouse gases such as methane and nitrous oxides. Now, this is unequivocally human-made. We know this. It's old carbon. It's dug out of the ground and burned and thereby ended up in the atmosphere. There's no doubt about it. Half of this carbon dioxide is actually going into the ocean, and it's making the ocean more acid. It's acidifying the ocean and thereby changing the ecosystem in the ocean. Now, you know that we get a lot of our food from the oceans, and a lot of life depends on the oceans, so this cannot be unimportant for us. However, it is kind of hidden because people don't realize it yet. The pH value has already changed. We can measure it. It also makes a lot of sense, but we don't act upon it. The Earth is also warming because half of this CO2 that we emit is staying in the atmosphere, and it's staying there for a long, long time. You could say it's infinite. The amount of time it stays in the atmosphere is hundreds of years, and you don't, unless you pull it out by planting trees and burying them into the ground or something like this, it'll stay there for a long time unless part of it goes into the ocean, which cannot continue forever. We have seen about a degree of warming over the last 100, 120 years. And you could say, well, what's the degree of warming? Well, it's not really this temperature increase that we are worried about. The temperature increase is the indicator of the big changes happening. Because a warmer world, a warmer atmosphere can hold more water in the atmosphere. And this water is just transporting heat around, transporting energy around, and messing everything up. I'll come to this in a minute with respect when we talk about extreme events. But let me first take a moment to tell you that I haven't used any model so far. Because what I'm telling you that carbon dioxide is increasing the temperature of the planet if we release it into the atmosphere is derived from very, very fundamental physics. It is the physics you learn in first semester or sometimes fifth semester, depending on where you study physics. But it's quantum mechanics and thermodynamics. And these people that I put up here are representatives of this. Actually, Boltzmann over there got crazy because no one believed in his thermodynamics. Now it's very hard to believe that people didn't believe in thermodynamics because we use it all the time, right? We wouldn't run cars or fly planes without thermodynamics. We wouldn't even cook without them. Well, we would cook, but we wouldn't know what we're doing without thermodynamics. So there's no model needed and there's no fancy whatsoever needed. It's just this very basic physics. That's why we are so certain that temperature is going to increase in the future if we emit more CO2. And we do so. We emit more and more CO2 every year. What you see here is the evolution of the emissions of carbon dioxide. Now, this is what we put in addition into the atmosphere in addition to what we have already put in the past. So the addition is increasing. This is almost like economic growth, right? The growth is growing all the time. Wonderful, but here it's not so wonderful after all. Actually, with this path that we have chosen in the past, we are following exactly the worst case scenario that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has dreamt up. Because when we talk about the future, and we need to talk about the future in order to inform you, the public, or investors or politicians about the future, For this, we need to think of what are possible socioeconomic scenarios for the future, and this is what I show you here. There's the so-called RCP 8.5 scenario, which is, you could call it business as usual, because that's what we're doing at the moment, as you can see here in the as the black curve. Do I have a pointer? No, I don't have a pointer, do I? Anyway, the blue path is the other extreme, if you like. It's the strongest climate mitigation efforts that we can think of, and this is the path that keeps us below the 2-degree target. You might have heard about the 2-degree target. It was first put out by the EU, then the G8, then the G20, and now the entire globe has agreed that we should not exceed 2 degrees of global warming unless if we want to avoid dangerous climate change. Thank you very much. Wonderful. So that's the business as usual scenario, and this is the other one that keeps us below 2 degrees. Now, note, we have negative emissions from 2070 on this path. We can talk about what that means, but there's a lot of money in this. I can show you that. And these are the temperature paths. As I said, we take quantum mechanics, we take thermodynamics, and then we translate the CO2 into temperature. You can do this on the back of the envelope. You get good numbers. If you want to do it, if you want to understand how the temperature changes from region to region and how the precipitation, the rainfall changes, then you need a model. And we first try the models on the past, and then we use them for the future. These are not economic models, they are physical models. So if we try them on the past, we actually make a statement, because they haven't learned from the past. They learned from Newton and Boltzmann and Planck, and then they can actually predict the past, and we can check whether they're right, and they are. So this is a 2-degree limit. And now let me take a moment to talk about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been under a lot of criticism and attack, and that's quite normal, I think, if you deal with a topic that has so much money involved in it globally, right? I just want to talk about the first of the 3 working groups, which is the one that I worked in, and that is the one that's dealing with the physical basis. Now, I just want to address the question whether we have been some small group that is hiding the truth from the rest of the world. This report that we put out for the 5th time was written by 260 scientists from 40 countries around the world. 3 years, we spent 3 years on this. We did this on the side without getting money. Anyway, that's not important. We wrote 1,500 pages that were based on 9,200 scientific articles. Only once you have published a scientific article that has been seen by at least 2 other reviewers, scientific reviewers, that has been accepted by this, it will enter this report. You cannot really hide this, especially when taking into you cannot hide the truth in this kind of system, especially when you keep in mind that scientists really always want other scientists to be wrong, right? Because if they're wrong, you're right, and that's good. And eventually, in the last stage of this report, what we do is we put the report out onto the internet. Every citizen on the planet can read it, can register, and provide comments that we then have to answer. We answered 54,000 comments, and these answers are publicly available on the internet. There's no hiding whatsoever, no data has been changed, nothing. And you can see this also by looking into the previous reports. The projections that I just showed you in the last report are precisely the same as the ones in 2007. The computers have improved dramatically, but it's not about the computers. It's about basic physics, and that hasn't changed. And it's the same as it was in 2001, right? So rest assured, climate change is happening, it's man-made, and we'll have to talk about the future. We already observe consequences of this climate change, this minimal 1 degree that we have observed over the last 100 years. Coral reefs are dying all around the planet. At a 1.5 degree warming, they'll probably all be dead. Well, not all of them, but practically all of them. 800 million people on the planet are somehow dependent on coral reefs economically. But they're also just beautiful, obviously. So we don't want to lose the Great Barrier Reef, for example. Permafrost is thawing. That's quite simple physics. If it gets warmer, permafrost is thawing, the same as ice is melting. And that was releasing a lot of methane. It's also destroying infrastructure. Houses, the people from Russia know this better than I do, but houses are getting destroyed, pipelines are being destroyed or disrupted. But we also get additional warming due to this methane that is bubbling out of the permafrost, because biological activity is already suddenly starting to get active again, is producing methane. And the Arctic sea ice. Well, you could say, why do I care for the Arctic sea ice? Well, we can get oil easier then, because in the Arctic there's oil. But you're destroying, obviously, an ecosystem of enormous proportions. The ice is actually green underneath. It's in the oceans, on the ocean side, and there's a lot living there. Polar bears, obviously, but much more is in these ecosystems. This is the cover of the Arctic sea ice after the melting period in 1979. That was in the middle of global warming, but it's the first satellite picture that we have of this region. And I just want to show you the decline in some snapshots. This was 2005. That was 2007, where we had a reduction of another 23% compared to the previous reduction in 2005. And 2012, another 23% reduction. It's always coming up again every now and then, but it's a clear path down on the long term. In winter, it's always covering everything again because there's no sun. It's really cold in winter. But what I can assure you is that the Santa Claus is not going to have a permanent residence on the North Pole anymore. In summer, he needs to live somewhere else. In winter, he's busy anyway. But in summer, he has to live somewhere else. And that's actually independent of what we're doing. That's a bad statement to make on an investor's day. You can't really do anything about it anymore because even the path that we are, the best path that we could go, the climate mitigation path, is already going to destroy the North Pole ice in summer. But there are things we can do. Sea level is rising, and sea level is going to continue to rise for centuries to come. But we can still say what level it shall rise to. Because for every degree of warming, we add another 2 meters of sea level rise on the long term. You see here the projections that we provided in the last IPCC report. It's about 1 meter maximum. That's what we said. I was lead author for the sea level chapter. So what we said is it'll be not more than 1 meter unless the Western Arctic ice sheet collapses. That's what we said. That was a double negative in the report. There's a lot of fighting and between the authors. What can you say? What can't you say? Well, unless the Western Arctic ice sheet collapses. Well, it collapsed. It tipped this year. In May, on a Monday, I was sitting in my office. There were 2 reports coming in that supported another report, not a report, scientific papers, that said the Western Arctic ice sheet has tipped. Now, what do I mean by tipping? Well, what I mean by tipping is not that it has already released all its ice into the ocean. That would be disastrous. It's worth 3.5 meters of sea level rise, the ice that's stored there. But it has started to release ice into the ocean, and it will not stop until it's empty. Because we've melted away a little piece of ice that held back the ice behind it, upstream of it, and we melted it away, and we can't take it back. So, not just for the generations that we care about, our children and our grandchildren, but even all the generations that will care about what we have done, like we care for what the Romans have done once on the planet. All these generations will suffer the sea level rise that we have already caused. But there's still something to be done, because Western Antarctica has tipped, as I said. This is here. But we found another spot in in Eastern Antarctica, which is worth even more ice, and that hasn't tipped yet. But with every degree that we add onto the global warming, we increase the risk of it tipping too. Now, don't be worried. That is all slow. But the question is, are there also fast effects that are happening? I just want to highlight again that we climate scientists are sometimes right about things. In 1979, when I was 5, John Mercer wrote an article in Nature saying that if we continue the consumption of fossil fuels as we do at present, in 50 years we will have doubled the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. That is true. We see it. We're almost there. It's almost doubled. And the Western Arctic ice sheet will tip. He said this in 1978, and it happened this year. That's because it's physics. It's simply true. But the question is, can abrupt things happen? What he also wrote in this article is that before the Western Arctic ice sheet collapses, there's going to be a collapse of small ice shelves in the peninsula of Antarctica. I'll show you the peninsula. That's this part here. This is closest to the north, so it's warmest. And then you see all these gray parts here. These are the shelves. And the Larsen B ice shelf collapsed within a period of 2 weeks. It's the only ice photo that ever made it to the front page of the New York Times in 2002. So you see this, these abrupt events can happen even in huge systems, because that is huge, right? This is much bigger than Berlin, obviously. But this is far away. So I'm just trying to get you to understand that fast things happen also in a slow climate change environment. But the thing that we really have to worry about are extreme events. And as I said, climate change is going to come upon us whether we understand it first or whether we don't. We understand the global mean temperature, but we don't understand climatic extremes. But they're going to come anyway. And we're very careful people, we scientists. We don't tell you stuff, well, at least I don't tell you stuff that we don't know, but we try to indicate what we must fear because of the physics behind it. So Ban Ki-moon can say the abnormal is the new normal. This year we've seen Manhattan and Beijing underwater, hundreds of thousands of people washed from homes in Colombia, Peru, and the Philippines. Mayor Bloomberg of New York can say that Hurricane Sandy is caused by climate change, but we can't. Climate scientists can't say that. What we can say is that events like this were unperceivable before. They weren't on our radar, and they're happening quick. And we can also say that in a warming world, there's more energy. This water vapor is transporting energy all around, and it's very likely that extreme events like Hurricane Sandy are going to intensify in the future. That's what we can say. And we've seen extreme events. We expect more heat waves. That's trivial. It's warm, so you get more heat waves. You also get more droughts. But that also causes more wildfires. Now, wildfires are generally caused by humans, right? But the conditions for wildfire are caused by climate change. Not only by climate change, but also. You might remember the Russian wildfire in 2010. That was special, and I'm going to highlight it here, because what we had there is what meteorologists call a blockade. A blockade of a high-pressure system over Russia. Now, generally, these move around the continent, and they linger some places only for a few days. This one lasted for 4 weeks. And that's why you had these fires. At the same time, you had precipitation, you had rainfall over Pakistan that was amazing, and that Pakistan did not recover from until today. Actually, they got hit by another monsoon like this the year after. But these two were interlinked. There was a blockade, and our climate models don't have these. They can do it in principle. They don't understand it fully. I want to emphasize this blockade because it's also responsible for Hurricane Sandy. I want to talk about this in a second. What is very counterintuitive is that we also expect more cold spells in some regions. Now, whenever it's winter and there's snowfall in Germany, the journalists come to me and say, it's cold. What do you mean, global warming? And I say, well, it's winter. Okay, they say, well, it's winter, but it's too cold. It's too cold for winter. And now we know why there can be really cold spells in Europe. Cold spells and snowfall that can disrupt the entire transportation system of Europe, like it happened in 2010 and almost happened again in 2011. Right? That's an industrialized country that was not able to move anything anymore. And let me very briefly run you through this mechanism because it's exciting and it's kind of simple too. This is Scandinavia here, and here you have generally sea ice in winter. I said sea ice is melting in summer, but in winter it's always covering everything again because it's so cold. Well, but when it was very sparse in summer, the cover is not very thick. And what can happen is that the ice breaks and the warm ocean underneath is surfacing, is uncovered. And that leads to a high pressure field that you get and that gets stuck over the Barents Sea. And that drags very cold Arctic winds into Europe and leads to this extreme snowfall. This happened in 2010, it happened again in 2011, and the Alfred Wegener Institute on the hill where we are also in Potsdam has shown that it is increasingly happening over the last 50 years. It's directly linked to global warming, and it's cold. The last physical system I want to talk about is the intensification of tropical storms. Well, people fight a lot about tropical storms. I don't know whether you've ever seen the forecast for tropical storms for a season in the US, for hurricanes in a season in the US. There are two places that do that, NOAA, the official one, and the University of Florida. These two projections that they give every season, they're so far off, it's amazing. They're completely contradicting each other, and they're improving it over the season. So at the end of the season is always correct, right? They're converging to the truth. What I want to tell you is we cannot do hurricanes. But what we can do is we can say how much energy there will be in the hurricanes of a season, because that's an average, and that we can do. And this energy is actually coming from the temperature of the surface of the ocean. It's not so difficult. That's where, the ocean, if you heat up the ocean, it's a lot of energy. And that's where they drag their energy from, the hurricanes. And if you take this into account, then you can actually predict how much energy there will be in the hurricanes of a season. You got to look at the right place in the Atlantic where they actually develop, and you got to look for the right period over time within the seasons so that you actually have the condition to get a hurricane. But if you take the temperature, the average temperature of this part of the ocean at this time of the year, then you can say how much energy there will be in the hurricanes. And sometimes you deviate, but in general, you're right. And this is going to intensify under global warming. There's no doubt about it, because if the atmosphere gets warmer, the ocean gets warmer. Now, Hurricane Sandy was still unperceivable. Why was it unperceivable? Well, hurricanes come, they develop in the warm region, they go towards the coast. Very often they kill a lot of people in the Caribbean before they enter the US. But then they wander off, they follow the general track of the winds, and they wander off back into the ocean, into the Atlantic, into the north where it's cold and they're out to die. But in 2012, there was a heat wave over Greenland, a very strong heat wave, the same kind of blockage, actually the same mechanism that caused the Russian fires that I told you earlier about, only on a different place of the planet. But you can shift these places because there's a jet stream. And because of the Arctic melting, because the high latitudes are getting warmer than the tropics are, this jet stream is meandering more strongly than it did before. It's more loose. And then it gets trapped. And it got trapped over Greenland, which meant that we had a huge melting period over Greenland this year. No one worried about that, really. It was just a record. It was just a record, but it was big in the media. But what really worried people later was that because of this it's a different picture here, this heat wave over Greenland, Hurricane Sandy took a sudden turn and went back to the coast where it hit New York. Now, 2 weeks ago, I was with the US Army Corps of Engineers in Boston, and they're changing their strategy. That it's a big company. Well, it's a big entity. So they move it slowly, but they realize that they have to go from a risk assessment approach to a resilience strategy, because they still want to avoid all the risks that they can avoid. But they have to realize now that there are risks that we do not perceive, that we do not anticipate at this stage. So putting it, I heard there's a lot of mathematicians, or at least people who love numbers in the room. You know about the Gaussian distribution, right? If you shift the Gaussian distribution, you get more and more extreme events because the society hasn't changed its threshold. You just shift the distribution and you get more in the fat tail of the distribution. Well, it's not a fat tail, but more in the tail of the distribution. That, for example, means that if you elevate the sea level by a meter around Manhattan, you get a storm surge that you had before every 100 years. You get it then every 3 to 4 years. That's the simple shift of the distribution. But what the US Army Corps of Engineers has now realized is we don't know whether this distribution stays the same. And because we don't know, we have to account for the unperceivable, the unanticipated. And that just means we avoid the risk, but we also prepare for the recovery. And that's resilience. It's just not just avoiding the risk that we know about, preparing for the recovery about this, of the stuff that we hadn't anticipated before. Well, this is just Coca-Cola, who's now changing their strategy with respect to the water, because in India, because they had a drought once and they couldn't produce Coca-Cola because there was no water anymore. But that is just a small piece that came out in New York Times in the beginning of this year. What I want to highlight is that if sea level was higher than it was in the past, we wouldn't worry if we had adapted to it. It's not the elevated temperature that worries us. It's not the elevated sea level that worries us. It's the changes, right? And these changes, and people say, well, we had bigger changes in the past. There was an ice age and there was a warm period, but there was no one around back then. But now we have the combination of extreme events with a highly elaborated globalized economic system. And the question whether our supply chains are actually ready for this is a question that we cannot answer at the moment. And actually no one has a model for that. We're preparing one at the moment in my group, but we're not there yet. I think people who work in economics and people who work in industry don't really like to perceive that there's a limit to anything, let alone the limit to the adaptive capacity of society. I wrote an article in The Guardian and a little earlier in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung where I asked the question whether there is a limit. Now, I don't know. No one knows whether there's a limit. Perhaps we are very resilient. I don't know. But let me just share with you why I wrote this article. The reason I wrote this article is because the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this time, for the first time, had actually not just had not just projected the temperature evolution until 2100, but for the first time just said, well, let's assume that CO2 emissions continue until we have no more carbon to burn. This is actually not the end of carbon yet, but they just continued the CO2 emissions into the future. And that's what came out. It's the same models that I could show you work for the past. They can do the ice ages, they can do the last 100 years, and they can do the future. And once I looked at this figure and said, well, this is the difference between an ice age and a warm period. We're living in a warm period already for 10,000 years, right? A period over which we have developed civilization. Very stable, warm period. Now we are entering a hot period. But this is the difference between an ice age and a warm period, 5 degrees. It generally takes about 5,000 to 10,000 years for this temperature change to occur on the planet. We are doing this 50 to 100 times faster. And if we don't stop, then we'll continue on this path. And I just said, and that's what I wrote, the Guardian article originally was titled, "There Will Never Be 10 Degrees of Global Warming." They took the article, they didn't ask me, and they changed the title to something that I don't even understand. And it's still the same idea. The article is the same. It just says, somewhere on the path here, there's going to be a significant disruption of our society, whether it's economic, whether it's in our jurisdiction, or wherever. I don't know, and I don't know when it is, but I don't think there's going to be a democracy in Germany when we have 10 degrees of global warming. But we are on the path of the third industrial revolution. That's what our institute's director, the advisor of the German chancellor, said a number of times. I heard that, I asked him, what was the second? I remember the first from school, but what was the second? He said, well, the introduction of computers, obviously. I said, oh yeah, obviously. And what is quite clear, that the introduction of computers was not bad for economy. I think we can be quite clear. There were winners and losers, obviously, but it wasn't bad for the economy. So after a talk that John Schellenhuber gave, someone said, well, he's going a bit further in his political analysis than I'm doing it generally. Someone stood up and said, well, whatever you're proposing is completely against the reality, the political reality. And then he answered, political goals should not be unrealistic, but if you're trying to make politics against the physical reality, good luck. So this is my last slide. Climate change will shape future businesses by disrupting our world more and more frequently and strongly, but also by shaping the political environment in which business is done and in which we try to mitigate as much climate change as we can on the way. Thank you very much for your attention.
What about the Gulf Stream?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true. Well, and there are what we call tipping elements on the planet. These are these huge systems that you push them a little bit, that nothing really happens. You push them a little bit more, and they just fall into a different state without you doing anything anymore, right? They're developing a positive feedback, a self-amplification, or whatever you want to call it. They're tipping. The Western Arctic ice sheet that I just told you about is one of these. The most prominent is what people call the Gulf Stream. It's the North Atlantic Current, but this is small stuff. It's a huge system in the Atlantic that is actually heating Northern Europe, and it's actually the only reason we can do agriculture in Northern Europe. If it collapses, the North Atlantic gets cold by 8 degrees. That's much more than we expect in the global warming. But it's only a redistribution of the heat. The south is going to increase its temperature. And there are a million things that are happening. If the Atlantic overturning, the Gulf Stream is collapsed, the monsoon in India gets disrupted. The rain belt over Africa is shifted a few hundred kilometers. People live there now where there's rain. They don't live where there's no rain. They're going to move then. The ecosystem in the Atlantic is completely disrupted, up to a 50% reduction in biomass in the Atlantic. It's a disaster. Even if it gets colder in Europe, you don't want that. We don't know whether it's going to happen and when it's going to happen. No one knows. It's really we tried very hard. There are a lot of people living, very wealthy people living east and west of this Atlantic, and they tried hard. Best scientists live in east and west of this Atlantic. They tried, I did too. For 10 years, we tried to figure out when is it going to stop, and we just don't know, because it's all about the precipitation change in the North Atlantic, the rainfall change in the North Atlantic, and we are not so good in predicting that.
To what degree are we able to understand how the kind of regional effects of climate change are going to impact the food infrastructure, agriculture, and our ability to feed the number of people on the planet?
Yes, we combine these agriculture models with agri-economic models all the time, and whenever you do that, the market finds a way. You have shifts in temperature and rainfall, but people adapt. The economy adapts. If you actually add the CO2 into the atmosphere, you also that's good for the plants. So we're not even sure whether there's a net net problem with agriculture altogether. There'll be changes. People will have to adapt. You know, farmers already now tell us. The farmers are the first to actually tell us things are changing. We have to do stuff, but they're able to do stuff, right? Now, what I don't know and what we don't model really is how extreme events will have an impact on that, because extreme events are generally bad. It doesn't really matter whether you have too much rainfall or too little. It's bad. You get too hot, too cold, it's not good. And we don't model that at the moment.
I'm just wondering whether this is a mankind disaster or just the end of the ice time.
If it's the end of the ice time, it very much depends on, well, it'll be the end of the ice time. But it very much depends on how fast this goes. Now, the sea level is not something that's going to kill us, right? We recently, actually this year, we computed how much of the UNESCO World Heritage Site is going to be underwater. And at 3 degrees, you'll have about 20% of the World Heritage Sites underwater. That's about 150 World Heritage Sites. Now, some people care for that, some don't. But it's something that you lose. But sea level is something that is really slow, gradual, and we will be able to adapt to it. It's not a threat to humanity. Extreme events is also, nothing is a threat to humanity, but it might be a threat to the way we live, because we're putting pressure on our societies. And if you look into the US, completely unrelated to climate change potentially, you have disruptions of society every now and then. After Hurricane Katrina, you had a disruption of society. In the UK, you have it. In France, you have it. We didn't have it in Germany yet, but we had it in Greece. People are getting on the streets because things are changing too quickly for them. And we don't model that. That's what I'm saying. We don't understand it by any means. I'm not saying we understand it, but society in itself seems stable if you live in Germany for the last 50 years. But it's not necessarily stable all around the planet. And if we disrupt it with these extreme events, I don't know what's going to happen.
Professor Levermann, I think the question was whether this may not just be a regular end of the ice age rather than man-made.
Oh, that was the question.
Yes.
I'm so sorry. No, it's not the regular end of the ice age. No, we're already out of the ice age for 10,000 years. There's no the ice age is when there's a lot of ice on the Eurasian continent and on the American continent. That's long gone. There was 120 meters lower sea level when we were in the Ice Age. This is past. And then there was the warm period for 10,000 years. We built a civilization, and now we're here waiting for the hot age.
Thank you very much, Professor Levermann.